So, good morning to all of you. On this fine Easter morning. So, this morning and this afternoon, can you hear? We will engage in the practice of Chenrezig. So, a couple of points to recall. Reminders for ourselves, and maybe for some, actually brand new. We are, whether we recognize it or not, responsible for our experiences, the easy ones, the difficult ones, the pleasant and the unpleasant. This morning and this afternoon, I want to remind us of a few of the key points regarding the practice of Chenrezig. And as many of you are aware, it's been my habit. I guess shouldn't use that word, right? It's not a habit, it's fresh each time. To ponder before coming on a day of Chenrezig or any other practice for that matter, to think of what might be a useful and helpful approach to whatever the practice is. So in this case, it's about Chenrezig. And one of the difficult things that we are trying to melt is our strong sense of who we are, which is to say our sense of self, personal identity from so many different angles, our occupations, our professions, our gender, our race, our sense of whether we're intelligent or not, friendly or not, compassionate or not. We would like to melt all of those ideas, put them aside, and just straight out recognize that we are each fully endowed with an awakened mind, merely waiting to be recognized so that we might fulfill our full potential. Since the identity that we have grasped and that we hang on to so tightly that it is difficult to set it aside. So it's good to begin today with the understanding that in order to fully understand and realize the practice of Chenrezig, we will have to find a way to set aside our sense of who we are now, which in comparison to Chenrezig or any of the other similar practices, we are too small. Not rising to the occasion that each of us is. So today, one more thing. Sometimes you think about something so much, then you forget about it completely. A kind of prerequisite to the fruitful practice of Chenrezig is to understand that we are each individually, to some degree collectively also, due to the truth of interdependence, responsible for all of our experiences. In order for the most fruitful unfolding of the practice of Chenrezig, we must hold that view. So almost nobody will agree that we are responsible for all of our experiences. If you punched me in the nose yesterday, I have trouble thinking I'm responsible for my bent nose. But in this case, sitting here together, imagining, I think we are responsible for the bent nose. Again, due to the truth of interdependence. Interdependence means that what I'm saying to you today will affect what you do for the rest of the day and tomorrow and so on. It will affect our relationship today and into the future and beyond. The way you speak and relate to other people is affected by what you do today and what you did yesterday and so on, so that in this way we understand the truth of interdependence. There is nothing that we do that does not bear some kind of fruit, sweet or otherwise. Our practice will be most effective if we hold this truth of interdependence closely. No matter how small or big, all our thoughts, all of our experiences, all of the things that we do, think, and say affect not only ourselves, but all other beings. Now, one could say, I don't believe that. And that's reasonable. It's a reasonable thing to disbelieve. It's awfully big, and it's a lot of responsibility. So we have this thing we call a view. Which is sometimes confusing. A view is not necessarily something real. It's kind of like if you pick up a pair of binoculars that look at something far away and then you see it up close. You could say, well, I see the view. What was far away now looks very close. If you're 10 years old, you'll think it actually is closer. But as an adult, you know it's not closer, it's just by virtue of the magic of the binoculars. But you also see things through that view that you didn't see without the view. So even though you understand it appears slightly distorted, you also understand that there's things there you see that you didn't see before. So likewise, we are continually changing our view of things and not noticing, forgetting that we're looking through this lens or these binoculars. In a kind of loose way, we could call a view an opinion. And if we were clear enough, we might realize that we're also responsible for our opinions. So what we want to do today is we want to hold a view. Not because the binoculars are the truth, but they're also not the truth. Because when you look through the binoculars, you see things in a certain way. And when you look without the binoculars, you see things in another way. And it's helpful, especially if you're driving a car, to know which one you're seeing. And the example is only good because it's humorous. But actually, all day long, we continually generate opinions and views, and we interact with each other. We interact with ourselves through those things. And mostly, we don't notice that that's what we're doing. Therefore, we have samsara, the world of confusion. And of course, we assign responsibility to everyone else, as if we all had the correct and accurate views. When we practice Chenrezig, we're engaging in a Vajrayana practice with a deity, and the deity is Chenrezig. That's also a little bit like saying we can see into the distance because of our binoculars, so too, by virtue of the practice of Chenrezig, the deity, we are able, through the practice, to discover things about ourselves that we would not otherwise be able to discover, or let's say, not easily able. So roughly speaking, we think of Chenrezig as the awakened mind, endowed with all the attributes of the awakened mind, free of hopes and fears, free of the challenges of self-centeredness, our pride, our greed, our anger, our joy, all these things that we have attachment and aversion to. Chenrezig is free of all those things. So in the practice of Chenrezig, it is critical, if you are to take it seriously and have some prospect of gaining significant insight from the practices. It's important that we hold the view that we are Chenrezig, that we are free of our hopes and fears, our challenges emotionally, conceptually, and all the other ways, that we are free of those things. And the practice of Chenrezig gives us a means, a kind of vehicle to hold the view that we are Chenrezig. So in one sense, we sometimes say, to kind of reduce the burden of embracing that, we sometimes say that the view is just a means to try and see something that we couldn't otherwise see. But in this case, it's really important to hold the view as if it was the truth that you are Chenrezig. Because the deeper teachings say you are Chenrezig. So I'd like today to have us go through the entire sadhana with the text, and along the way stop for just a moment and remind ourselves what we're doing and why we're doing it, so that we can refresh over and over. Sometimes I can say from my own side, if I do a practice, I find it useful every few minutes, literally, to just remind myself what I'm doing, because our minds drift so easily into other things. Oh, we'll be finished soon, and I'll go to lunch, and then this will happen, and so on. We have to catch that, bring ourselves back over and over and over, because that's how we formed the habits that we currently have. They didn't happen just suddenly out of nowhere. Habits formed by virtue of repetition. I like that person. I'd like to meet that person. I'd like to see that person. Or I don't like that person. I hate that person. I hope I never see them. The habit forms by repetition, not by accident. And in this way, we also can take responsibility for being Chenrezig by virtue of repetition over and over and over. It's a much more joyful thing to be. Okay. It's a religious day today, right? We should have music, but we don't have an organ. We have our voices. So we are going to chant some things. Is this mine? Must be. We need to have a relationship with each of the elements in the practice. And so as we move through it, we'll stop and just remind ourselves of what the element is.
Does anyone need a text? Put your hand up there, passing them out. Okay, good. Thank you.
So are we all in possession? So commonly we begin any practice turning our minds from all of our worldly preoccupations to refuge in the Buddha, refuge in great beings, and so on. But in this practice, in the text, if you look on page 1, it says the prayer to the Lamas of the Mahamudra lineage. So we begin this practice by acknowledging where the practice came from, where our teachings came from, and the names in the text are in one sense not important. So if you know what the names are, it's helpful in the way of recognizing a name and maybe recognizing a teaching that was received at some point from someone. So we begin by reciting this lineage prayer, which goes up to page 6 in the text. The page numbers are on the far right side of your text. So starting on page 1. The point here is to think from your own side that I have a sense of appreciation for having received the teachings that I have received, however many or little they are. I appreciate the teachers of the past and present and so on, with whom I have had relationships, some of them relationships by virtue of reading the text and reading and hearing the teachings from the individuals who are named in these texts. So we start by giving ourselves this sense of appreciation, which is really helpful. And we'll talk a little more about that later. So I'm going to ask Melinda, who is our Omse, if you would lead us in the prayer for the lineage. English or Tibetan? We will recite this in Tibetan because we need some music.
Yada dorje chonchen ken Narojana Siddhi Jano Marpachuki Lodru Jano Milaje Padorje Jano Dakpo Paldendu sun kenpa keno situ drugun rechen keno pondrak sunan dorje keno druchen kama pachi keno ke drubo genchen bo keno semparang jung dorje keno Yawayun tun jenpo jeno samling chuki drakpa keno tokten kachu wangpo jeno Juje deshin shekpa jeno Jetsun ratna badra jeno Trukutong wadundan jeno Kunyen jamba zambo keno Jansen baljo dundru keno Yawan jodra jamso keno Druchen drashi baljor keno Some mikyu dorje keno Gyawa kunchok yen la keno Jetsu wancho dorje keno Garwan chuki wancho keno Yawa choyin dorje keno Palden yeshen nimbo keno Some yeshen dorje keno Pachen chuki dundru keno Yawang janchub dorje keno Situ chuki dunne keno Jetsun dudu dorje keno Mi panchu dru jamso keno yase lo dutaye keno kun sanka kya dorje keno pema wancho gyabo keno paden kien se uze keno rangjon rikpe dorje keno drupwan norbud keno kya dak rangjun kun kya keno bokar dorje changwan keno Trinchen sawe lama keno yedam kilkor latsor keno chukyong magun chandra keno daksor drodru semchen kula tuze yeshe chenpoy zikne cha chene lu tukbar zoji.
Now on the next page it says begin. So they don't know we already did. Begin with going for refuge. It's always helpful when beginning a new section, big or small, in the practice to remind yourself, slow down a little, remind yourself of why you're doing this practice in general and this section in particular. Refuge in this tradition is meant to be the grand antidote to our confusion and our suffering in this world. But in order for that to work, we have to have some understanding and some relationship with the practice and with the liturgy, rather than just reciting. It's nice to also grasp the meaning. Refuge is there because the Buddha more than 2,000 years ago noticed the causes of suffering in the world, and at the time of his full realization, he recognized the antidotes to that suffering. And so refuge is a way for us to take a look at that. Our busy lives, our intense desire for activity, so strong that we, more often than not, cannot resist it. Slowing down even is almost impossible, especially if we are in the midst of some powerful emotion. It's like we fell overboard in the high seas. We forget where we are, why we're there, and most important, we forget how to get out. So the willingness to recognize the causes of suffering is in a way a prerequisite for effective refuge. You have to have a reason for the refuge. And if it's tied to your emotional states, that's very helpful. So the truth is that often we think it's not helpful. We think that our emotional states are harmful. In the beginning, they are harmful. But once we recognize the role they play in our discomfort and our suffering, they are not harmful. We have seen them. And once we see them, we know what to do about them. So instead of turning our minds to refuge in all of our material activities and our worldly activities, we turn our minds to refuge in the Buddha. And now the sort of shocking revelation. We are the Buddha. We have inherently an awakened mind. We may be physically asleep. We may be drunk, literally, and totally confused. We may be overwhelmed by anger and all sorts of emotional states. But that awakened mind, we say, is untouched, not spoiled, impossible to remove, impossible to improve. The one missing element is that we do not recognize it. The Buddha himself said, when asked by someone who approached him, it is said, and asked the Buddha, what is the difference between you and me? And he said, there is none. But I recognize that awakened nature, and you do not. Aside from that recognition, there is no difference. Of course, the recognition is a significant difference. It's important to remind ourselves that we are not less by virtue of anything that we have ever done. Our karma, good or bad, does not make us more endowed with that awakened mind. That is such a fundamental bedrock position in the lineage and in the practice of Buddhist things. Our job is to come to the place of recognizing that awakened nature. In fact, you could say the entire path boils down to that one end. So when we turn our minds to refuge in the Buddha, it's an antidote to our intense habitual pattern of turning our minds to refuge in all the worldly things. It doesn't mean actually that we shouldn't have worldly things, that we shouldn't have families, that we shouldn't have nice cars or nice homes or whatever. But the degree to which we associate those things with happiness, we're in trouble. It's interesting that almost every spiritual tradition says exactly this. In other words, as sentient beings, pretty much we've recognized it for a long time. The difference here is not the recognition, it's really the issue is the method by which we come to recognize it. So we begin by recognizing it in the simplest way, as we just said. We turn our minds to refuge in the Buddha, remembering we are talking here about two things. In a kind of very almost fundamentalist way, we could say the physical being of the Buddha 2,500 years ago. That's totally fine. It's a far better refuge than the new car. Go for the Buddha. We'll figure out how to drive it later. We want to take our mind off of the worldly things. That's number one. We go for refuge to the Buddha, first maybe to take the mind off the worldly things. Having taken them off, we discover other things that we can do with the mind, then think about what we need or what we don't have or what we want that we don't have, all of those things. Now, the key in the going for refuge, because refuge is not the only thing, we need to go for refuge in order that we might wake up from the confusion and the suffering and to be able to benefit others. And let us cut short the idea that it's a martyr tradition. How many times in your life have you experienced great joy by successfully helping somebody else? My guess is you can't count them. If you could bring great good fortune and happiness to a group of miserable people, my guess is you would say that was an ecstatic experience. In comparison to our small wish for a better car, a better this or a better that. So we're going to read this text, the refuge piece, and up through page 11 and 12. Refuge here includes what we just talked about, and it includes maybe the single most important term in the entire tradition, especially in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition and the Vajrayana, and that is the term bodhicitta. Refuge and bodhicitta need to be linked together. And bodhicitta is this wish that we would actually wake up to our awakened state. And become able to direct all of our efforts for the benefit of others. And again, remind yourself, this is not a sacrifice. This is what you actually want to do. You may have given up. Reasonable. If you didn't give up, then you never tried. It's very difficult to benefit others. Mostly others don't want to be benefited. They like to be rid of you, benefiting them. So reasonable to give up. with an apology or something equivalent to that. So moving right along here, as slow as we could possibly go. On page 11, we will recite, where am I? Did I miss? Oh, 9, sorry, back to 9. Page 9. We're going to recite, is it up through 11? Up through 11. We're going to recite it once in English. Do your very best to pay attention to the meaning and remind yourself while you're reading it what the meaning is. And when we recite it in Tibetan, which we will sing because it's a day for music, remind yourself while we're doing that what the meaning is. If you don't need to understand the Tibetan, you understand the meaning is good enough, even better. Okay? So we'll begin on page 9.
I need further clarification on the language. I need further clarification on the language.
What?
The first one in English.
Oh,
And then-
one time. I'm sorry.
And then the Palden Lama.
Do you want one time in English?
One time in English and one time in Tibetan. Yeah,
Okay.
for this round. So for those of you who don't know, normally we recite everything 3 times. But it's not like in stone. And we won't have time to get through today if we recite it the full number of times. So I think it's helpful to get the meaning in the English and a little reference, and then recite it in the Tibetan, which is also quite beautiful, chanted. So that way we get all of those things, and you can recall that normally we recite many of these things 3 times or more. You can go home and recite it 108 times and enjoy the sound of your own voice. Okay? Really. Thanks, Melinda.
From this moment until the heart of enlightenment is reached, I and all sentient beings, equaling the limits of space, we go for refuge to the glorious holy lamas. We go for refuge to the yidams, the deities of the mandala. We go for refuge to the Buddhas, the transcendent conquerors. We go for refuge to the sacred Dharma. We go for refuge to the noble Sangha. We go for refuge to the assembly of Dakas, Dakinis, Dharma protectors and guardians who possess the eye of intrinsic awareness. Palden Lama Dompa Nam La Kya Sujyo Yidam Kil Korji Latso Nam La Kya Sujyo Sanje Chom Den De Nam La Kya Sujyo Dambe Chu Nam La Kya Sujyo Pabe Gendu Nam La Kya Sujyo Pawo Kandro Chujon Zomezo Yeshe Until enlightenment, I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the excellent assembly. Through the merit of generosity and other virtues, may I accomplish Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. Sanje Chudan Soki Chok Nam La Janchu Padu Dani Kyab Suji Dagi Jen Soji Pe Sonangi Drola Penche
Now we're on page 12. This is the section which is titled, as you can see on the top of page 12, Generating the Visualization. So just in summary here, we'll go through it, I will go through it once, and then we will again use the English one time and the Tibetan chanted. So the English says, on the crown of myself and sentient beings, pervasive as space, is a lotus and moon seat. So let us first note, once again, as we did in the beginning today, everything that we do with our minds, our speech, our bodies, bears a result. Most of the time, we pay absolutely no attention to all of that. Occasionally, we notice, occasionally we change things and all. In the practice of Chenrezig, as in all of the practices in the Buddhist tradition, as far as I know, we want to see what we're doing. We want to be aware of what we're doing. If we can't change it, we want to see it, at least. And we want to create circumstances by which we might transcend the causes of our own suffering. Let us not forget the bodhicitta says the aspiration of bodhicitta is to attain complete awakening. That is number one. Number two is so that I might be able to benefit all sentient beings. So do not be confused that we begin with ourselves. We have no ability to really deeply benefit others unless we are free of our own confusion. So we begin by creating the circumstances by which we might be on the path, we might ultimately attain awakening, and we might be able to manifest the aspiration of bodhicitta to benefit all sentient beings, which is fundamentally to say, at that point, we have become the Buddha. We cannot become the Buddha if we stand steadfast, believing that we are not endowed with the awakened mind already. You can't play the piano if you actually firmly do not believe that you do not have hands and fingers. So we must have this sense of we are endowed with the nature which a Buddha manifests, but which we nonetheless also possess. So on the crown of myself and sentient beings, pervasive as space, it says, is a lotus and moon seat. Now the view. You're looking through that glass. And what do you see? In front of you are uncountable sentient beings. Not just a lot, uncountable. Like no matter by what means, they cannot be counted. It's not like as many stars as there are in the sky and the universe. Even that is not enough. It's uncountable. Those beings gather because of your aspiration. So it's important to think that when you think of beginning the generation phase, which we are at, that your aspiration to attain complete awakening in order to benefit all sentient beings, you think to yourself that your aspiration is so clear, so right, so kind, that amongst all of these people are your mothers of the past, all of these beings, whether they are insects or humans or animals, ghosts, whatever it might be. There is not a single one who has not been your mother. And if your current mother wasn't so great, we have to forgive ourselves from time to time. That same being was your mother another time. And along the way, that person was so kind to you that they literally sacrificed their life on your behalf and were happy to do it. So that's the mother you want to put into the generation. The person who was unbelievably kind. So your aspiration then is, first you see all of these beings in front of you, and you imagine that on the crown of your own head, with sentient beings pervasive as space, is a lotus and moon seat. So here we have to imagine that on the crown of our heads is a large lotus flower that is completely open on the crown of our heads. And resting on that flower is what we call a flat moon disk. The moon disk is flat and it sits kind of like a frisbee, you might say, on that lotus. And you imagine this as clearly as you can, but at this point the clarity is not as important as the sense that it is there. You can't count the sentient beings either, but if you've ever been to a baseball game, you can't count those sentient beings either. There are so many. So here we have just uncountable, like as many as molecules in a glass of water. It's just uncountable. And on the crown of each person is this lotus and moon seat. It's surmounted by a syllable. And the syllable Hri is what we call it. It's what we call a seed syllable. A seed syllable is something that is going to become something else, just like the seed that you plant in the ground and you water it and it becomes something else. Something that you couldn't have imagined if you'd never seen it before. You wouldn't know that the seed was actually the cause of the thing that came from it. In this case, you know what the cause is. So the cause comes from this Hri. Now in this moment, if you know what the Hri is, you should visualize it. It's on the page 11, on page 12. If you look down on the bottom line, in English letters, it says Hri Le Pak Chok. You see that? And down below that it says, from the Hri appears the noble Chenrezig. But above the HRI, there is a seed syllable. Now that syllable also is not critical to be able to visualize. If you can visualize it, it can be helpful. If you can't, you can imagine above the moon disk a small white sphere, like the size of a lentil, just hovering above that lotus flower. And that lentil is brilliant light. And that light shines in all directions. And it strikes all sentient beings who are in front of us. And it strikes the Buddhas of the past, present, and future who receive the light as an offering. And the light returns from the Buddhas and by virtue of the first time that the light from the Hri struck all beings, they also appear with the Hri on the crown of their head, sitting on a lotus and moon seat. When the light from the Buddha returns and strikes the Hri on the crown of the head of all sentient beings, if we can imagine this just kind of like in a moment, on the lotus and moon seat, the Hri is transformed into Chenrezig. Now, this ritual may feel a bit difficult, and the following explanation may not make it easier. But I want to add something which could be very helpful in your life in general. And that is that we do regularly, without even knowing that we're doing it most of the time, things that are many, many times more complicated than this. You remember your mother's face when she was kind to you. You remember it when she wasn't kind. You remember the accident that you had 15 years ago, as clear as a bell. And we don't think, wow, I can remember those details. But of course, we take that for granted. So in this case, I'd like you to just take it for granted for a moment to begin with, that actually this is not difficult. This is simple. You walked in the door today and walked. If you've been here before, you didn't think, now I wonder what a door is. And where is the door? And where do I go to sit? You just walk in and you sit down. How many times did that take? Twice? 3 times? And then you don't think about it anymore. So if we just kind of like a flash, think of these things unfolding, and then don't try to maintain them. Don't make an effort to maintain them. Just like you don't need to make an effort once you've lit a candle, you don't need to make an effort to keep the candle lit. It stays lit for a while. So this also can stay lit for a while. You remember it, and then you suddenly realize you forgot. In the moment that you forget, refresh it. Just recall it, just for a moment. And in time, like all other things, it becomes easy. So now it says, if we go down to the third line, so to speak, I understand third line, second line, first line doesn't actually always may take you a while to find it if you're not used to it. The third line, which we already saw, from the Hri appears the noble Chenrezig. This is on page 12 at the bottom. Clear, white, and radiating five-colored light. Now the five-colored lights have a special meaning. I'm going to leave that for now. Those of you who know what the five-colored lights are, I rejoice. But for now, we just think that from the Hri appears the noble Chenrezig, just like that, instantly. And from Chenrezig's body, which is clear, white, it radiates five-colored lights. We'll come back to that. I'm thinking in this moment, as usual, when I shouldn't be. It's time for a break. So we will, up to this point, we'll dedicate the merit as we usually do. If you know it, it's fine, participate. Otherwise, we'll dedicate the merit together, and we'll take about a 15-minute break, okay?
By this virtue may I
quickly realize Mahamudra
and establish all beings without exception in this state.
On the break, please, if you will, observe silence for this time up until the lunch break. That'll be very helpful.